Good morning, everybody. Hello. We should get started. We've got a fantastic panel. I assume you're all here for the panel on climate justice. If you think you are, you indeed came to the right place. So good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Miller. I'm on the faculty here. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. And I'm also one of the organizers of this year's Congress on Sustainability Justice. And it's really my pleasure to welcome all of you to what I expect and I'm confident will be a fantastic panel. We've got terrific speakers, and this is just such a timely, crucial topic. What I wanted to do to spice things up, we've got a long day. What I wanted to do is something a little bit different to start. So, what I would like to ask, we're going to have the three presentations, and then at the end we'll have time for discussion. But at the beginning, I would like for you to consider yourselves and meet a neighbor, make a friend, and briefly, we'll talk for just a few minutes on what is climate justice for you, if you can be brief in talking to your neighbor. Obviously, these are huge questions. And then why should we care? Why is it important? And I wanted to do this just to get us all collectively in the same mindset of the topic. And then we'll see how your thinking changes or not, or is reinforced, etc., through the great presentations that we're going to have. So I would invite you to make a friend and briefly discuss these couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists. Okay, so I'm sure that you all answered the questions. I have to say that it's very gratifying to see such engagement and excitement. I hope that you met somebody new or at least had an interesting discussion with your neighbor. Please keep these questions in mind, as well as whatever other interests you might bring to the table as we listen to these fantastic presentations. And we'll come back then at the end, and perhaps some of the thoughts that you generated now you'll be able to sort of resurface at that point. What I wanted to do now was invite Dr. Summer Gray to give our first presentation. I will briefly introduce her. So Dr. Gray is an assistant professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on community resilience, adaptation, infrastructure, and the environment. She is a member of the Environmental Justice and Climate Justice Research Hub at the university and a do-it-yourself filmmaker, I think, which we'll see reflected in her beautiful slides. She's written about climate justice in a number of different academic and other outlets. Her research is focused on connecting practices of shoreline stabilization with emerging and uneven geographies of sea change, particularly in low-lying and climate-vulnerable countries. Her work highlights the lived experiences of coastal communities throughout the world that are facing the threat of sea change and the unintended consequences of global development. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Summer Gray.
We got to bring this way down here. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I feel really honored to be here and to be speaking on these issues, and thank you for joining me today. As you heard in the introduction, I'm from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I teach on issues of climate justice, and I also research on this topic. And with the recent climate strikes that just took place, this is actually great timing for a discussion like this. So it's really maybe it was intentional or not, but here we are talking about climate justice at a time when a lot of my colleagues are really focusing their lectures and their lessons on this very topic. And it's really encouraging to see a lot of young people in the audience. You are exactly the type of group I want to talk to today. So today I'll be sharing some insights from my research, but first let me give you a bit of context for why we should be caring about and talking about these issues to begin with. As many of you know, we live in a world inundated by massive social problems, obscene poverty, inequality, cultures of violence, and the systemic racial, environmental, and economic injustices. And each year, new studies are coming out that paint a more dire picture of the future. In fact, I woke up this morning to news that scientists are predicting even more sea level rise coming in the future. So now it's likely that we'll see more than 3 feet in the next century if we continue down the path of business as usual. And we know now that we have about a decade to respond and do something different to avoid going above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what's particularly troubling about this is that those who have contributed the least to this problem will be impacted first and worst. Sorry about that. So here's an image that I like to show. It's an artistic rendition of climate change showing some of the data with some. But what I want to say is that this is really disappointing, and I know a lot of people are feeling this intensely and maybe even having an emotional response to what's coming. And I don't want to downplay how wicked this problem is and how difficult it is to address, but I do want to remind us that wherever there is struggle, crisis, history tells us that there's also opposition. And so I'd like to focus for a minute on the climate justice movement. The climate justice movement, a movement that I've actually participated in and researched, is a network of movements dispersed across the world, many of which are engaged in frontline fights for climate justice at every level and on all continents. They're in left-wing and ecological parties and organizations, in labor movements, student movements, women's movements, and movements for the rights and dignity of Indigenous and other communities of color. Theirs is a multi-issue activism and an intersectional movement working to ensure that social justice is at the center for how society is responding to the problem of climate change, or perhaps better said, climate disruption. And so I want to emphasize that in contrast to the larger climate movement, the climate justice movement represents one of the leading waves of radical social change. And I think that's important to make that distinction. Yet, as climate justice activists fight for system change, for many, change on a global scale will not come soon enough. Even the slightest rise in temperature will have devastating effects for small island states and communities that reside in the danger zones of the world. And we're talking about many of the 680 million people around the world that are living in low-lying coastal zones. Some form of adaptation is necessary, and I'm curious, what kind of form will that take? So the title of my talk is Climate Justice or Just Adaptation. And to be fair, this is really a trick question. It's not an either or. It's more of a play on words. And so by this, I mean, will adaptation arrive as just a response to climate change, as just a way to transform our buildings into futuristic fantasies and images of car charging ports and rooftop gardens, the stuff that we heard about if you were here in the previous panel, talking about green gentrification? Or will adaptation be fashioned as just adaptation, meaning intervening in the very uneven and unjust set of problems that created the conditions for vulnerability in the first place? So by the end of my 20 minutes, I hope that you'll see why we need to complicate our understanding of adaptation using frameworks from climate justice, and think very differently about adaptation moving forward. And I want to do this by introducing 2 cases from my research. The first one is what I think illustrates an example of what I call reactive adaptation. That is adaptation that takes place after the outcome of climate disruption. For example, we can think of the contentious rebuilding of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, urban renewal projects that have taken place there as an example of reactive adaptation. The case I want to highlight today comes from my hometown of Santa Barbara and its neighbor Montecito, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. The second case that I want to illustrate is an example of proactive adaptation from my research on sea change in the Maldives. And this is where adaptation is taking place in anticipation of climate change or climate disruption. So let me start with the first case and kind of give you a context for what happened. On the morning of January 9th, 2018, after a month of record-breaking fire and a few intense moments of rain, the mountains in Montecito broke, and truck-sized boulders flowed down in rivers of mud. With little warning, 23 lives were lost, and over $420 billion of property was destroyed or damaged. In the aftermath of the disaster, most residents were understandably in a state of shock, having never heard of or seen a debris flow before. Some even felt that these events were particular to other places in the global south. As one resident noted, "I know flash flooding and landslides happen in foreign countries, but the mud and debris flow, this is new for me." So let's look at some of the factors that contributed to the deadliness of the debris flow in Montecito to try to understand this a bit better. So what made this disaster so devastating? Well, part of it was poor development planning, building in high-risk areas. This is really incentivized by the individualization of risk and insurance policies that create incentives for people to build in high-risk areas, which is then maintained by ingrained value systems, like the protection of property when something bad happens. So when a fire happens, a barrier is created, and protecting those homes is the priority. What also happens in events like this is a lack of maintenance that can occur when you start to get comfortable and you start to think that the environment doesn't change, that it's kind of stable. And so there was a lack of creek and basin clearing leading up to this that contributed to this problem. There's also the problem in gaps in knowledge and forgetting. These kinds of events have happened in the past in Montecito, but they happened so long ago, people don't have living memory. There's also gaps in failures in communication. So telling people about the dangers didn't work, partly because they weren't communicated in the right language. And I'll talk about that in a second. The one I want to highlight here a little bit more is the existing social inequalities that contributed to the deadliness of this disaster. So for those of you who don't know, debris flows have been written about and talked about as disasters of social vulnerability. But this observation is usually about things going on in the underdeveloped parts of the world. So these are places where you can see a lot of impoverishment, economic restriction, spatial restriction, so people being moved out of places and having to go to more precarious places, and also political disempowerment. All of these forces really pushing people to live in dangerous places. But as I argue, and I'm writing this paper now, this also applies to the case of wealthy and predominantly white Montecito. In the aftermath of the debris flow, it was service workers and the undocumented who represented nearly a third of those who lost their lives. And it was only after the debris flow, that people started to recognize that more than 50% of homeowners in Montecito employ maids, housekeepers, nannies, gardeners, and personal assistants. Many of these folks are undocumented and therefore not eligible for things like FEMA assistance. Not to mention that a lot of the service workers were left behind during the evacuations to look after the properties. When you combine all of these factors together to consider the underlying problems that contributed to the devastation of the debris flow, you can start to see how adaptation or recovering from this and rebuilding can contain similar blind spots and systems of inequality created in cultures of privilege. So in my study of the post-disaster landscape, I found a lot of things. I found neighbors fighting with each other over building walls to protect themselves from the future, which would put the neighbor next to them at risk in that event that another one of these was to happen. I also listened to concerns from residents who were lucky enough to make it out undamaged, but were upset because their neighbor, who had total devastation of the home, had a chance to rebuild and rebuild higher, changing the topography of risk. And so when these things flow, now maybe they flow into their home. I watched as the city came in and widened creeks, disrupting people's sense of place. One respondent complained that the Army Corps of Engineers, quote, blew up everything larger than a loaf of bread and made it all rubble, end quote, comparing the new layout in Montecito to the wide, empty desert washes in Las Vegas. And not long after the disaster, I saw a privately funded group of wealthy business owners emerge, pulling money together to form what they called Partners for Community Resilience. And this sounded great. This sounded really promising. But what ended up happening is they engaged in a move to bypass city governmental process using emergency permits. And so currently they're at work installing 11 steel ring nets in creeks to hold back boulders in the canyons above Montecito. And meanwhile, environmentalists are concerned about the environmental impacts this might have on the endangered steelhead trout. And others who have a more nuanced understanding of the situation are concerned that this could create a false sense of security moving forward and contribute to an even deadlier event in the future. But the one that I want to kind of briefly mention here that was most alarming to me and surprising was the post-disaster recovery effort that involved city trucks dumping sediment on public beaches using emergency permits. So this is Goleta Beach, and it was the most impacted. And of course, you can expect that this generated an outcry among environmentalists, right, who were immediately going in and testing the toxicity and finding high toxic levels of all kinds of stuff in there, and they were worried about how that would impact the local ecosystem. But there were other groups who also noticed that this wasn't only an environmental travesty, right? This was a particularly racist and unjust takeover of public resources. This beach is utilized by low-income households, by the way. So Goleta Beach is one of the only beaches in the area where I live with free parking in a public park, playgrounds, barbecue pits. It's not a tourist beach. I live in a very tourist place, Santa Barbara, like maybe you've been there. But this beach is used by 80% local residents and 20% travel from the valley to gain access to the beach. 46% of the visitors to this beach are from lower income households, and lower income households who visit this beach visit it 9 times more than other income households. So that kind of gives you a sense of who's using the beach. Yet, when we talk about Montecito in Santa Barbara and what happened, the focus is overwhelmingly still on the positive community that emerged, a sense of community, that 805 strong. And this has been the subject of many articles, films, and even a book. And I can understand it as a way to sort of collectively understand what happened and overcome it and deal with the trauma. However, this coming together, while it was real, it's ephemeral. It doesn't last, and it overlooks a lot of communities that were invisible or forgotten. And so I argue the post-disaster landscape is not simple, and the communities formed immediately can dissipate. And similarly, Rebecca Solnit writes about this in her book, A Paradise Built in Hell. Part of the problem is that recovery is individualized, just like risk. And this can also result in the transfer of harm from privileged areas to areas that are deemed less valuable, less important, less beautiful, and less likely to resist. So now let's look at my second case and see what happens with a case of proactive adaptation. The Maldives, once the poster child of climate justice, was made famous in John Shank's film, The Island President. The small island country has been depicted as a sinking island, defenseless against even the slightest change in sea level rise. And while this is not untrue, the story is a lot more complicated. Vulnerability plays out in the context of authoritarian politics and rampant development. Also, many people don't realize that the Maldives is home to one of the most densely populated islands in the entire world, even more than New York. Many accounts of the Maldives and other small island states wash over these messy interconnections, avoiding the history, the development, and the infrastructure in favor of simple narratives. This is a picture of Male. And as you can see, it's a tiny island. It's just 2 square kilometers, and it's home to 1/3 of the population, an estimated 350,000 people. Last I heard, 360,000 people. And they're congealed around the few modern social services that exist. Next to Male is a housing project built by the government that consists of a pile of sand that was dumped into the neighboring lagoon. And it's named Hulu Male, which translates to New Male. And there's a picture of it. Hulu Male has been praised by the international community as a proactive solution to climate change, as a good example of adaptation. However, it's a lot more complicated, like I said. And in terms of like the actual height of this island, that's one critique. It's not built high enough to really even address, the predicted height, the higher sea levels. And in the future, it's going to need a big seawall to hold that sand in place, right? The other thing is that it has to be understood in the context of an undemocratic process that's going on right now in the Maldives to consolidate the population into a handful of what are called safe islands. So this is forced internal relocation. And this scheme was introduced by the authoritarian dictatorship to relocate the Maldivians live scattered. A lot of them live in rural islands. And the idea is instead of giving them resources like hospitals and schools and other kinds of things, we'll just force them to move to islands like this. And it can't be understood without paying attention to the larger story of political struggle and the systematic violation of human rights in the Maldives. Those I spoke to when I was there indicated that this was not the pathway that they wanted. In fact, the revolutionary democratic government led by Mohamed Nasheed, the island president, opted for a different pathway of building an inter-island transport system that would create the accessibility so people could live in remote corners and still have access to resources. And one wonders, what would adaptation look like if it was, shaped through a democratic process? Oh no. Okay, so let me skip ahead a little bit here. There's a seawall. And this is what my research really, I'm writing a book about how seawalls sort of transfer attention away from social resources and also how this creates a situation that is really untenable for many people around the world. Okay. This image is an image I like to show my students. It's an image of a rendition from a Japanese company, and it was featured in a documentary called Sinking Islands, Floating Cities. And it highlights sort of a futuristic design that's presented as a solution to climate change for low island or small island states. And I like to show this to my students and ask them, what do you think about this? And they comment, oh, it looks like a luxury resort, or it looks like a, luxury condos. And so then we go through the sort of the nuances and get to a more deeper understanding. All right, so some observations about these two cases. In the case of systemic structure collapse, like in Montecito, reactive adaptation is often individualized and can even be carried out on a citywide scale, has relational dynamics, and can often go unnoticed in the planning process. And in the case of sea level rise and proactive adaptation, we can see a lot of techno-utopian fantasies and also unjust transformations taking place. So how do we avoid this? How do we make sense of all this? And how do we kind of recognize when these kinds of things are happening in our own communities? And in order to arrive at that, I argue that we need to really break down what we mean by resilience, which is often conflated with adaptation. And this is a buzzword. It's really popular. It sounds great, and I'm not trying to, dismiss it altogether. But I want to argue that we need to move beyond thinking about resilience as just bouncing back. Similarly to how we question sustainable development, sustainable for who? We have to ask, bouncing back from what? And so I think we need a more transformative definition, and here's one definition that really emphasizes eradicating inequalities and the roots of the problem as part of that resilience building process. And just adaptation embraces this transformative definition. I've heard it called different ways. So just adaptation can also be thought of as socially just adaptation. Fair adaptation is probably, one way, an easier way to understand it, or just transformation, which I really like to use. So just transformation. So these are all similar ways to call the same thing. So really quickly, in conclusion, how do we build a critical climate adaptation framework, taking all of this in mind? We have to recognize that vulnerability is a process that entails social and material inequalities in context of injustice and the unfair distributions of harms. This means getting at the root of the problem, even if climate change isn't the only harm. It's not always just climate change. We also have to treat adaptation as a process, just like vulnerability is a process, so it is adaptation. It has to involve maximum engagement. It's not a state of being. It's not something you can simply achieve. It's a process. And I think I want to mention here that I think it was mentioned yesterday that just engaging publics is not enough. Sometimes adaptation and resilience planning can be put forward by the state. So state-led resilience can also allow the state to neglect social resources and services and force the communities who are most vulnerable to have to take care of the situation themselves, and that's problematic. And lastly, promoting just transformation by addressing injustice in all of its forms. So that means recognizing that we have to be radical in how we approach adaptation. We have to recognize the racial, gendered, and environmental injustices that are taking place. And I would add to that also recognizing future impacts. Intergenerational justice is important here. So I will end there. And sorry I had to rush through. I talked a little slower than I timed myself earlier. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Gray. Our next speaker is Dr. Tony Reams, and I will pull up his presentation here. And even more than that, I'll just say a couple introductory words about Tony. So Dr. Reams is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability. He is also he's the director of the Urban Energy Justice Lab. For this year, he's a JPB Environmental Health Fellow at Harvard University, and I think very recently has become a 2019 GRIST 50 fixer, which some of you may know what that is. If you don't, I invite you to talk to Dr. Reams about it. So his research investigates fair and equitable access to affordable, reliable, efficient, and clean energy. So we're going to sort of shift to talking about energy. His research employs energy analysis, GIS, and policy analysis tools to investigate disparities in residential energy dynamics, focusing on the production and persistence of spatial, racial, and socioeconomic inequality. He's a multidisciplinary scholar with degrees in civil engineering, engineering management, and public administration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tony Reams.
All right, good morning, everybody. Yeah, good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Daniel, and thank you all for being here. I want to take you through a little journey setting up this idea of energy justice, and then talk about two case studies that look at how this is actually used to mobilize people in Kansas City, Missouri, and Detroit, Michigan. So first I want to highlight that there is this issue of energy insecurity, right? And so a recent national survey from the Energy Information Administration shows that 1 in 3 U.S. households face some challenge when it comes to meeting their energy needs. And you can see some of the factors of energy insecurity, such as receiving a disconnect notice, keeping your home at an unhealthy temperature, which is really important when we think about climate change, and also reducing or foregoing basic necessities such as medicine and food just to pay your energy bills. And so this table or chart looks at how many people experience this monthly, just some months throughout the year, or about 1 or 2 months throughout the year. So as Daniel stated, my background is in engineering, and then I did a PhD in public administration because I wanted to kind of bridge the gap between technology and policy or program implementation. And I was going to study green infrastructure. So I know we talked about that a little bit in the previous panel, but I was doing my PhD during the recession because I was working in local government, and I knew we were about to do layoffs, so I knew I needed a plan B. But it was interesting because I was in school during the time of the economic stimulus. And so there was all this money that was put into kind of green initiatives, sustainability, energy, and that's how I kind of got into this energy justice research. And when I was doing my research, this quote here from a report from 2004 from the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation really stuck with me and got me to look at this intersection between energy and race. And I'm sure you all have had some time to read it, but it says, where U.S. energy policy is concerned, African Americans are the proverbial canaries in the mine shaft. And again, there was not a lot written about race and energy because we don't really think about how those things intersect. But I want to show you some data, again, from this national survey that kind of highlights why this is important. So when we look nationally at just annual consumption, I kind of split it up here between white households, black households, Asian households, and Hispanic households. And the orange line is the national average. And so we can see, on average, white households consume more energy, and it declines across other racial and ethnic groups. And so if you look at this, we know there are a lot of energy efficiency programs, energy conservation programs that government and utilities implement. So if you were to look at this data, who do you think those programs actually target? Which households? Right. Well, and yeah, thank you. Yeah, a lot of the programs actually end up going to white households, and it's because we're kind of looking at this consumption, like whose consumption do we need to curb? But if we're actually focusing on energy efficiency, there's a better measure called the energy use intensity, which is basically how much energy are you consuming per square foot, so we can normalize it across household size. And here you see kind of a shift in who's using more energy per square foot, which means their houses are less efficient. And so black households and Hispanic households on average are using more energy to heat or cool the same square foot as white households or even Asian households in this case. And this shows up again when we think about the annual cost, right? Which makes sense. If you use more energy, you pay more. But then if we think about this as a cost burden, again, trying to normalize this so we can compare apples to apples, you see black households have a really high energy burden, right? Spending on average almost 8% of their income on energy compared to just over 5% of the national average. And so before I get into this idea of energy justice, we have to wrestle with kind of this philosophical question: is energy a basic human right? And I'm not going to ask people to raise their hand because I have not answered this question myself either, but it is something I think we should think about when we want to apply a justice framework, when we want to talk about equality and who gets energy, how much we pay for it, should it be a commodity? So kind of think about this as I go through the presentation. So what is this idea of energy justice? What do I study? Like some concepts, this started as kind of a developed versus developing nation inequality or disparity exercise. Here in the US, we have 100% energy access, and so this idea that other countries are bearing the burden of our overconsumption and not having access to the modern technologies that we have, and so we always started to talk about this energy oppressed poor. And energy is so important, right, to everything we do, and so this idea of justice ensures that everyone can afford the energy they need for health and well-being. And then applying this justice frame allows us to kind of stand on the shoulders of the environmental justice movement and research, where we can understand disparities across race, class, and place. And again, this idea is international, right? So in the Sustainable Development Goals, number 7 is that everyone should have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. And so the United Nations has a goal for us to have 100% electrification by some point. And then a colleague of mine at Columbia University, Diana Hernandez, thought about, well, what does this look like in the US, right? We think about, the lack of modern access in developing countries, but here in the US, as I showed at the first slide, there are people who are struggling to access energy here in the US. And so she said, if we thought about it as a right, there are 4 basic rights that exist. The right to healthy, sustainable production, the right to the best available infrastructure, the right to energy that's affordable, and the right to energy that's uninterrupted. And so a lot of issues around shutoffs, especially in our large cities and in some rural areas. So if we try to understand what a just energy system is, it's an energy system that fairly disseminates both the cost and the benefits of energy services and is representative and impartial in decision making. And so I'll talk about the decision making in one of the cases later. And it involves a few elements. So when it comes to cost, how are the hazards and externalities distributed, and making sure that marginalized communities are not overburdened. The benefits, right? Who's getting solar? Who participates in renewable energy? And then the procedure. Who's at the table when decisions are made? How many people have ever been to a Public Service Commission meeting or Public Utility Commission? This is kind of, yeah, right. So it's a few hands that went up, but you know, this affects all of us, right? I studied this and I still have not been to a meeting, but yeah, that's a whole nother story. But no, like, you know, a lot of us as consumers don't participate in decisions that are very important to how we live our daily lives. We couldn't have this conference, I guess we could, but it would be dark and we wouldn't be able to show slides. And so again, just thinking about a just energy system where we're all engaged in that process. I want to show this too because when we think about it from a justice framework, it's very interrelated. So you have distribution, right? So we know we have inequalities in income distribution. Energy prices differ, or sometimes they're the same because we don't have a choice of our energy provider. And I showed you how energy efficiency differs across race. There's also this idea of recognition justice, like understanding who's vulnerable, what are the needs of individuals. So when we think about elderly households, what do they need from an energy perspective compared to younger households? And also this aspect of respect. I've done some studies looking at energy assistance programs and how people have to go through the process to apply for assistance is very, I don't know, there's a lack of respect in how that process is carried out. And so if we're thinking about this from a justice perspective, how can we change our program processes to give people respect when they need assistance? And then the procedures, I talked about that. Decision making, what are your legal rights, access to information. And so some scholars have put together a conceptual framework, and the way they try to address this is going from something that we can all get around, right, energy availability, to some of the things that are a little harder down at the bottom when we think about intersectionality. And so you see a lot of programs try to address the first two, availability and affordability. So now how does this bridge this idea of climate justice that we're talking about? Kirsten Jenkins, she's a scholar in the UK, wrote a study that was trying to look at where energy justice fits between environmental justice and climate justice. And she says that energy justice concept provides a more focused means to tackle injustices, and then it has these environmental and climate knock-ons. And so it's kind of like, if you focus on energy, then you'll get some of these environmental and climate benefits. I don't necessarily agree with the way she frames it, but I think it allows us to at least think about how these things connect. So now I want to talk about two case studies really quickly that kind of look at this community-based approach to energy justice. One is in Kansas City, Missouri. So I have some numbers down here at the bottom. There was a study by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and they kind of ranked the 48 top metro by population on where they ranked across energy burden. So Memphis is number one. Memphis has the highest energy burdens in the country, which is really interesting because it's a public utility, which we would think public utilities would not rip their people off. And it's also served by the federal government through TVA. And so you have the federal government charging a local municipal utility a really high rate, so then they end up charging their customers a really high rate in a really low income city. And then the second one, first in Kansas City, the study goes through the Green Impact Zone, which was a program under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that did a lot of sustainability-related stuff, but I kind of carve out the energy piece. And then in Detroit, a new action called Work for Me DTE, which DTE is the largest utility in Detroit, and this community group, grassroots group, rose up to say, we're gonna engage in DTE's integrated resource plan. We're gonna tell the utility where we wanna get our energy from, which is like unheard of. And so why do I focus on this community-based approach? So there are kind of 4 things that this approach offers for energy justice. It supports equity and justice and democracy. It acknowledges that there are a lot of complex decision-making that goes on when people, interact with energy, make choices, and it's not like some simple thing that we can understand. It also fosters social connectedness, so people talking to each other, people working together, people saying, in this place, this is how we want to address energy. And then it creates institutional capabilities where people can go out and do other things after they make this mobilization around energy. So first, the Green Impact Zone in Kansas City. Again, this was a $200 million public-private investment, capitalizing on stimulus money and also getting some private companies to get on board, some nonprofits. And so the Congressman Cleaver, was the head of the Congressional Black Caucus at the time. He was also the first African-American mayor of Kansas City. And he wanted to take this economic crisis, which again, we had the discussion about using the term crisis because it was created by some other factors, but he wanted to say like, okay, this is an opportunity, this is a moment. How do we, use this moment to bring about change in a community? And so I focused on the weatherization piece of that program. So they got $4.5 million. Congressman Cleaver, in all of his wisdom, went on TV and said, we're gonna weatherize every home in the Green Impact Zone, which he's known for making some of those grandiose claims, but again, you can see there were about 6,000 housing units. You can't do that with $4.5 million. So they actually completed 329 homes. They had proposed to do 659. So it was a really great case study to understand like what worked, but also what didn't work. So one paper that came out of this study was trying to look at how this community-based approach could overcome the barriers to this kind of federal program that has all these issues. We did walk-along interviews with residents to kind of understand what the assets and liabilities were in the community from their perspective. And so the 2 questions were, what are the barriers that still exist when you remove the financial barrier from energy efficiency? And then can a community-based approach effectively identify those barriers and overcome them? And so I'm not gonna go over all the barriers, but I wanted to show you all kind of what came out of the study. So of course there were still some economic or market barriers, a lack of information, split incentive, which is when you're in a rented property, your landlord knows that you pay the utility bill, so they have no incentive to make an energy efficiency investment. Still some regulatory problems because even though the stimulus was to spend money fast, it was operating in kind of these long-standing programs that had a lot of challenges. But the 2 I want to focus on today are public priorities and public distrust. So the first challenge in the Green Impact Zone was going into this disinvested community, over 50 years of disinvestment with urban renewal, various city initiatives to, change the community, and most of that resulted in like new bus stop benches or, maybe a sidewalk here or there. And so when people came into the community saying, we're gonna spend this money, we're gonna make you sustainable, we want you to be part of the 21st century, like, what are you talking about? We've heard that before, you've said that before, we never saw the money. And so it was like, how do you make sustainability, using that buzzword, make it real in the community? And so they hired some residents to kind of run the program, which was a really great thing to start with. And they said, well, the first thing, we need to connect sustainability to the economic and social challenges in the community. And so the environmental benefits of weatherization kind of became like a co-benefit because it was really about, let's help you save money on your energy so you can stay in your home. Again, we're in the recession period where we're talking about people losing their home because of mortgages. And then we want you to be leaders in the environment. We want you to be able to say, I'm helping the environment because I participated in this program. Okay, thank you. Another part of social barrier was public distrust. So I like to use the two women here as great examples of this. So one thing was people were afraid of the energy audit. And I didn't realize like how much nomenclature really matters, right? And so Kansas City was really aggressive when it came to codes violations. And so this term audit, knowing that someone was gonna come in your house, people were like, hell no, right? You know, even though this was something that would be beneficial for them. And so I like the woman at the top, she had been working in the community for, about 3 decades. And, in a community development corporation, but she said, even though I have cred in this community, this initiative needs to be different. They need to have people that look like people from the neighborhood. And so they did some community-based social marketing, and they used this woman, Ms. Riley. A lot of times I like to play her video, but I know I didn't have time today. But she's sitting in her community center building, and she talks about her experience with the program. And so she goes and says, they gave me a new furnace. I called it Little Thunder, and Little Thunder keeps my house so warm, and my bill went down, and so for the elderly residents in the neighborhood, that meant the world, right? So everybody's like, I want a Little Thunder, I want a Little Thunder. But again, it was like this idea of taking a community-based approach to doing something that, again, was couched in sustainability, but knew that it had these economic benefits as well. So really quick, I'll run through some of the action in Detroit. So again, I talked about DTE. They're a large investor-owned utility serving Detroit. So again, their primary mission is to make money for their stakeholders or shareholders as well as provide energy. So we passed some laws in Michigan in 2016 to say that utilities needed to do this long-term planning, so 15 to 20 years, on where they would produce their energy, how much it would cost, and make sure there's reliability and affordability. So as this was happening, this group kind of sprung out of nowhere. It was really interesting, and this is a new part of my research, but the group is called Work For Me DTE. And so they have this logo, they have T-shirts, doing some amazing things. And so on their website, this is their call to action. They say, right now DTE is making decisions that will impact your family and households for a generation, and without your input. And I thought that was very powerful, right? Because again, just by the representation of how many of us have participated in this type of decision-making process, they called it out. Thank you. So DTE is like, okay, we might close some coal plants, but we're gonna replace them with natural gas plants. People are like, no, that's methane, and so now you're going through all these issues of people trying to say we want solar. And so what I thought was really interesting with this group is that there was a public service hearing in Detroit, which, if you all don't know, that's unheard of because the Public Service Commission has not hosted a public hearing in the city of Detroit, the largest city in the state, in years. They usually had it out in the suburbs. We have really poor public transportation, so people can't even get to the meetings. But they turned out, they say over almost 100 people. The Public Service Commissioner said about 50, but they did a training. They trained people how to make public comments, how to leave public comments on the Public Service Commission's website, and look at the signs. They're talking about clean energy now, climate justice, we demand safe, affordable energy. Like I say, even the Public Service Commission tweeted about it, saying that this was supposed to be a 3-hour meeting, but it ended up being 4.5 because they had so many people lined up to go up to the microphone to make public comments. So just to wrap up, a few things. We must recognize that there are existing and persistent disparities when it comes to energy. We must have a discussion about rights and what that actually means. Like, should there be free energy, or should there be a block of free and you pay for more? Using established frames of justice are beneficial. They help us identify who is at risk. They help us implement plans, and they're great for mobilization. And they employing a community-based approach to energy justice is one way to get people engaged. And then counter to some narratives, I really wanted to make this my last point, is that Black people do care about and are actively engaged in movements around energy, sustainability, and climate change, because there is a dominant narrative because of representation in some of the more traditional groups that people don't care. But I think we also need to expand the definition of environment when we think about communities. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. So our next speaker is Dr. John Daigle. I'll pull that up. So I'm going to just say a brief bio, if you don't mind. So Dr. Daigle is a tribal member of the Penobscot Indian Nation and professor of forest recreation management in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine in Orono. He received his PhD in forestry from the University of Massachusetts with an emphasis on the application of social science concepts and methods to outdoor recreation and natural resource planning and management. In 2008, he became part of an interdisciplinary team of the faculty at the University of Maine to identify potential climate scenarios, their probabilities for Maine for the remainder of the 21st century. He led a team that explored the meaning of a changed environment as it relates to the indigenous peoples of Maine. He's continued to work with efforts to understand the implications of large-scale environmental change to cultural practices and identity. Dr. Daigle served as a review editor for the first ever Tribal, Indigenous, and Native chapter in the 3rd National Climate Change Assessment Report and has published numerous papers with other co-authors on climate change and its impacts on indigenous communities. Please welcome Dr. John Daigle.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event, and also the opportunity to meet and talk with folks that are attending the meeting here, because it's very informative. And you know, just with the variety of presentations that we have here, the faculty, the diverse faculty here that are coming to these sessions to learn from speakers and from each other is very promising, because I think part of the future solutions as we think about addressing climate change is interdisciplinary efforts that are necessary. And, you know, sometimes I feel like I have to explain, well, what's a forest recreation professor talking about climate change? But really, it really kind of dwells back down to my roots, you know, growing up in Maine. My grandparents were basket makers, spent a lot of time in the out of doors with extended family doing outdoor activities. And I realized at a pretty young age of the value of those outdoor experiences, the storytelling, the family connections, the history. And it motivated me to become interested in, this is important. Outdoor recreation is important for people to be outdoors and enjoying the environment. And it kind of led me in the career of being a park ranger for the Park Service, and then working for the U.S. Forest Service as a U.S., you know, as a researcher for the Forest Service for about 10 years before teaching at the University of Maine. And I just go through this because I think that, you know, again, there's a lot of different folks that need to contribute, I think, in the coming years. And your path may change over time as you're going through your career. And it was really only 10 years ago that I started to get more involved in the climate change research arena. And so your path might be going in different directions, and you can contribute, you know, your knowledge from mentors that have been teaching you through the years to particular issues. So come with it with an open mind, I guess, is what my advice for students that are getting your education. So I want to share with you just an overview, and again, it's a short amount of time, so I'm going to kind of go, you know, through this very briefly. But you know, with the, you know, early efforts in terms of trying to understand climate change effects and how that may implicate Indigenous peoples of Maine. And as part of that process, it kind of reinforced to me the importance of social science research. At the early outset, with some of the climate change meetings, we wanted to know what was going on with our forests, what was going on with our seas, what were kind of the biophysical changes as a result of climate change. And there wasn't a whole lot of human dimensions effects of climate change. And I think we're starting to see more of that, and I applaud the organizers of this committee to kind of bring in more social science pieces to kind of climate change. So I want to share some experiences, specific to Maine, but then also share some experiences with my involvement with other Indigenous communities in North America. And, it was mentioned yesterday in some of our previous speakers, I think, there are certain things that make Indigenous peoples particularly more vulnerable just because of the place-based nature of where people have grown up for generation after generations. There is a connectedness to those places, the interactions with those features of the landscape, that when we see changes occurring, it impacts that culture. And it kind of impacts that culture in similar ways, no matter if it's a tribal community in Maine versus out west in Arizona. And because of the threats that we're seeing and the impacts that are resulting, I think it has motivated energy and people coming together, and I want to talk about that today because someone mentioned again today just the struggles. It is kind of a mechanism where people are joining together, and I think people joining together brings more power to the conversation, and having people's voices heard. So before I begin, I just want to, again, just give a little base information about, tribal populations. And that's my home up here. And again, you can see the different shades of green, and it goes into a kind of a yellowish color, but that's just the population densities of tribal communities, in the United States. And I guess the point I want to make is, you do see less density of tribal populations on the East Coast, partly, I think, as we all kind of learned through our history, just with disease, a lot of period of death over a very short period of time for tribal populations on the East Coast. But some tribal populations persisted at very low numbers, but still persisted. And of course, depending upon the relationships that you had, the Penobscots and other tribal communities in Maine were important allies to the Americans in the Revolutionary War. So, and that in effect dictated some of the responses after the Revolutionary War of not being displaced. And that's true with some of the other tribal communities in the East. But even after the Revolutionary War, it was talked about yesterday, we had displacement with, kind of tribes continually being pushed, particularly in this region, but, out west. But, again, I want to emphasize, though, when we're thinking about tribal nations, it is a lot of different tribal nations that we're involved in. In fact, there's 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And there's over 200 tribes that are non-federally recognized that are still trying to get federal status. So we're talking about a lot of different tribal communities that are spread across the United States, and I think that's important to kind of keep in mind. And, as I mentioned, I think, understanding kind of those cultural connections to the land is important, particularly in understanding kind of the impacts that occur with Indigenous peoples. But again, it's also other people that have long-time connections to areas, but particularly Indigenous peoples. And I think it is kind of surrounded in that investment in that area over time, in the stories that are told and what you've learned growing up. And values and meanings are associated with that landscape. And reinforced, I think is important, reinforced through the physical interactions with that environment, i.e. outdoor recreation or other kind of forms of outdoor interaction. And and rightly pointed out yesterday, again, in terms of some of those long-term connections, the physical connections, there's also the spiritual connections. And this is consistent with Gluskop, kind of a cultural hero for the Wabanaki. You know, there is that interaction with nature. You can see through this story. I don't need to read through all of it here. But basically, the creation story was Gluskop shooting an arrow into the trees, and specifically the black ash tree, where the Indian people emerged and populated the land. And there's lots of different stories of how the interactions and help from animals taught stories, taught actions with lands and how the landform was created. So that cultural connection and the interaction of plants and animals and non-living things is really important. And so even today, you know, there is, for a lot of tribal members, it's an important piece where we still try to maintain connections. I'm a professor at the University of Maine, but I love to hunt in the fall. I love to collect fiddleheads in the spring. I like to berry pick in the summer. I like to try to, you know, maintain sustenance through the food that you know, that's part of the landscape of Maine. And it just brings back those memories of my grandfather that I used to hunt with in the fall. And when I go hunting this fall, it's those places where we hunted that reconnects me to family and members. And again, it's a variety of resources. And again, I'll talk a little bit about some of the transitions that we're kind of seeing because of those kind of close interactions with nature and what we're seeing kind of on the landscape. But again, the act of practicing kind of reinforces the values that's important, the storytelling, the harvesting, the sharing. That is an important piece here. And so it was really, again, you know, some of those early climate change effects meetings that I was part of, there was not initially any discussion about having a chapter that was focused on Indigenous peoples of Maine for this Maine report going to the governor. But I immediately started to make some connections about what I had seen through some forest modeling and seeing kind of habitat changes and the shifts, the implications it has for species that live in that habitat. And seeing kind of potential implications of what we call cultural keystone species, particularly species that are really important. I mentioned my grandparents were basket makers, and there's a lot of Wabanaki basket makers. It's black ash. A lot of Wabanaki citizens call it brown ash, but it's basically the same thing. But there's a very rich history. It's one of the oldest art forms in New England. With the basket making, an important income stream, you know, in terms of adding that to your family income. And it was really through some of the early modeling where we had a current stand, you know, of black ash. This was the U.S. Forest Service model, looking at kind of species change as a result of different climate scenarios. And you can see here, just at the top part of the United States, the green and the yellow, that's again kind of the density of black ash currently. And again, in Maine you can see yellow, but it's kind of spread throughout the state, but there's black ash in Maine, spread sporadically. But, you know, into the future you could see those black ash trees slowly moving out of the region, slowly moving up into Canada. And would there still be access to those to practice basket making? Would it stay within the stories? You know, I started to kind of think about kind of the implications of these kind of geographical range changes. And it's not just with black ash, but also sugar maple, where you can see it's a little more extensive here. But again, through time, it is shifting and changing and leaving the region. You know, what are some of the implications of those things? And you know, and that was, you know, quickly one of the kind of the connections I made as a young faculty member, which kind of then generated my interest in this area. But then I started learning more. I started investigating more about kind of the effects of climate change. and the implications that it has on Indigenous peoples, you know, kind of around the world. And it really kind of reflected back on kind of, well, what's happening here in the United States? And I don't know if you're aware, again, I mean, these are things that we do see, these kind of geographical range changes. Trees are pretty, you know, vivacious. They can survive a lot of things. Having a little trouble with this emerald ash borer with the ash tree, which is a big concern. But we're talking about 100+ years before it would probably leave the region of Maine, okay? But there's other important dynamics going on that involves wildlife populations. And I don't know if some of you had heard, but just last week, published in the journal Science, they reported since 1970, North Americans have lost have lost avian bird species, 2.9 billion bird species. This was published in Science last week. And that's 29% of the avian population in North America in less than half a century. So we're kind of seeing immediate effects in terms of implications that it's having, you know, on wildlife and wildlife populations. Surely, you know, conversion of land and habitat changes contributing to those changes, but also we're clearly making connections to climate change and the risks that they pose to animal and plant species. And here, this is just a summary again of kind of locations of the world that are at most risk, and also types of species that are more at risk. And I don't know if, I'm sure many of you have been kind of following the, you know, Greta Thunberg and her eloquent way of speaking. And, but, you know, things are happening now, and they're going to be happening over a very short period of time. And, you know, of the 8 million total species now, in the next couple of years, we're thinking it's expected that we may lose 12.5% of our biodiversity in the world. And again, certain species are at more risk, you know, than others, which I think is very important. Also, that's coming into the equation, and again, some of this is repeated from things that were shared yesterday. But again, where we kind of, when we think about Indigenous peoples, again, it's, you know, Indigenous peoples in the United States make up a pretty small fraction of our total population, right? 2 million, 3 million people. But again, and even worldwide, total populations of Indigenous peoples might be making up kind of the smaller portion of our population. But again, you know, they occupy some very important places. And it was mentioned yesterday that 80% of our current biodiversity exists in places where Indigenous peoples live. And that's kind of basically in 28% land base, right, in the world. So having that interaction, having a conversation, having a voice, I think is going to be increasingly important as we think about Indigenous peoples. And because we're seeing effects, we're seeing a desire to try to be a little more a voice for us, I think there is a very strong desire for Indigenous people to want to be sitting at the table, collaborating, and having their voices heard. And I think it's in part because of the strong interactions and what they're seeing on the landscape. And it was through some of that early work that I did in Maine that other folks kind of reached out, and we had a first stewards meeting in Washington, D.C. I think it was a year or so after Maine, but other people certainly had been doing studies. But it was a result of kind of bringing that awareness. This is, again, was through the Obama era, where kind of more voice was being heard, more action being demanded, and kind of we started to see some agency response, I think, to this. And again, there's been a lot of good, I would say very limited science, but one of the really important outcomes of that particular meeting was the networking of tribal communities, Indigenous scholars, non-tribal scholars interested in Indigenous issues, where through that initial meeting, where again, these were tribal leaders mostly from the West Coast and the Pacific Islands that brought folks together kind of on a national level, but it really brought together kind of Indigenous scholars working together, kind of IDing each other, talking face to face, and those communications persisted with the goal of having more kind of scientific research into the literature about, well, what are the impacts of to Indigenous peoples, just to kind of elevate that up. And we're continuing to see that more in our scientific literature, but again, there wasn't a whole lot other than a few studies, in anthropology, So this to me was an important piece. Again, others supplemented it, but the articles that were published in this particular journal were really a cornerstone to information and documentation that added to the National Assessment Report. And this is the first, the chapter in that National Assessment Report. There has been a subsequent report, with an Indigenous peoples chapter, so the conversation kind of continues, and we can see things that are happening over time. And so, in terms of, again, thinking about not only the impacts, I also think that it's important to maybe start to think about adaptive capacity. And I think we need to be careful, right, in terms of thinking about, Indigenous peoples being the solution or the answer all. I mean, we're going down a path where there's not much we can do. We're going to have more extinction of species with the actions that have been taken. But so there are really some important things that I guess I wanted to share with you to kind of end kind of the conversation and kind of lead into some of our discussion. And that is, in terms of thinking about not only the Indigenous peoples and the cultures and the connections to the land, but also the language that's associated with it. Katil Nabam Nuag, it's a Penobscot, Passamaquoddy word, but it kind of encapsulates kind of a meaning and relationship to the land, all our relations. And this is the language. Sometimes I'm kind of converting this into English, but there's a lot of meaning and responsibility, in the words that are shared. And all our relations involves the interactions between us and other people, other animals, and non-living things. And there's this expectation of that relationship that goes into the future. And I'm not sure if you've heard of some nations thinking 7 generations forward. There's an ethical stream that seems to be consistent in a lot of Indigenous culture in words that are shared in meanings that I think are really important. Mina ka talu ka damen. Again, we move together, and again, this is another. It's an important word, and again, where we're kind of moving through this environment, through time together, and caring for each other as we move together, and being cognizant of maybe your effects to other things. And again, this is important. I mean, it's an old word, but it's an important word. It means something, and I think that those are. I think it's an area where we're going to see some emphasis already. Many of you may have know that the United Nations General Assembly has dedicated 2019 the International Year of an Indigenous Language. At this point in time, we have documented between, and again, this is a rough number, between 6,000 and 7,000 languages throughout the world. And we have about 1/3 that are critically endangered of being lost. And most of those are Indigenous languages that have these important meanings and relationships to our resources. And I think that needs to be of concern. And, more than half of the world population speaks just 23 languages. Okay. So kind of assessing and understanding, maybe reassessing kind of maybe potential future solutions, I think is important. And I always ask my students, avoid a long, texty slide. But I did want to share this, because this is one of my ending slides that I think is important. And again, this is a colleague, Robin Kimmer from Syracuse, who has published some great work, like other Indigenous scholars, but very meaningful. And I'll just quickly read this. Ethnologists tell us that our great-grandparents spoke a fluent natural history. They knew the name and personalities of dozens of birds and plants. Today, the average American schoolchild can recognize more than 100 corporate logos. They can give name to about 10 plants. And these include categories such as Christmas tree and grass. We have lost an entire vocabulary of speech, of experience, and of a relationship. Our fundamental currency of relationship, our highly evolved capacity for paying attention to those species and who sustained us, has been subverted in a kind of intellectual hijacking. How can we care for them, monitor their well-being, and fight for their existence if we don't even know their names? And again, I think that is kind of the challenge as we kind of think through. And it's not to say that everything is hunky-dory in tribal communities, because there's still a lot of challenges, right, in terms of sustaining traditions, interest in cultural practice in some cases, but also in the advancement, I think, of encouraging our young Native youth pursuing a career in higher education and contributing back to the community, and having an interest in natural resources management. I mean, there's a variety of fields that are necessary, right? But, you know, that is certainly a goal. And I think, as well as what Robin would say, you know, in terms of speaking the language, the act of practicing is very important, because those are where your values are instilled. And that's kind of where you maintain the meaning that's associated with those words. That's really important. And this is an ash basket maker who I've been working with for the past 10 years, who has actually been now involved in some of the courses that I teach. So we're actually starting to look at the curriculum that we're teaching at the University of Maine in terms of kind of integrating more indigenous knowledge into some of our kind of natural resource management, planning and management. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you to our three panelists for just fantastic and thought-provoking presentations. I'm struck by how diverse they were, covering forests, coasts, cities, different groups. And I myself have been taking notes and drawing connections between them, and I think they raise a set of really interesting questions that we could spend probably the rest of the conference talking about. Unfortunately, we have 10 minutes until lunch, and we would not wish to stand between you and lunch, but let us have a little bit of an appetizer and open it up for questions to any of our panelists. I would encourage questions that are synthetic of nature, if you can think of them, that maybe apply to more than one of our panelists, and leave some of the specific ones maybe for one-on-one discussions. If you have a specific one that you're burning to ask, we won't forbid it. But turning it over to all of you for questions.
Thank you so much for these great presentations and for the conference more broadly. One of the themes that came out very clearly in your presentations but has been percolating throughout the conference is this notion of trust and the role that trust plays in how we govern the environment, how we relate to each other, and how we might think about justice. And the legacies of distrust, right, that have produced so many of these situations that we're now in. And so my question is around what you think the role of trust might be in bridging, right, the challenges that we face, and where do we start with rebuilding trust and making those connections and repairing the distrust that is so much a part of our society today.
Great. I don't know who wants to start. Summer, you were at the beginning. If you want to start.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. I'm not going to say too much on this issue of trust other than to note that, you know, I recognize the tensions of doing scholarship in places that have, you know, been systematically denied human rights and all of these issues. And so I think like part of it is just being reflexive and mindful of how we go into community and how we engage in research that not only exploits and extracts information to share, but also helps build and bridge and helps people who are engaging in these very real issues reflect on their own set of problems. So I know when I go to the Maldives, for example, and I ask, what do you think about climate justice? I get this look like, this is not the right question. And so I think listening and engaging and humbling, oneself is part of the process. But I think like your work speaks directly to this and engaging in community-based methods. So maybe you have more to add.
Thanks for the setup, Summer. No, that's a really great question, and as academics, we struggle with how we measure trust, which has its own set of issues. But I'll use the Kansas City example. A big thing, like I say, was the words we use, right? And then kind of this whole idea of recognition justice, which is like recognizing who's vulnerable, recognizing the needs of folks, recognizing kind of the historical situation that people are existing in, and what role whoever is coming into that community has played in how people view that actor. And so from a policy perspective or program perspective, really, understanding that there is no one size fits all when it comes to a lot of this stuff, right? And so how can we recognize who communities are, what they want, what they need, and if you're trying to help, then ask communities what help looks like, which is what I think the Green Impact Zone found, was that going in and saying, oh, you're going to be green, that was not necessarily the right way to say it. And especially recognizing that people did not trust the local government, and so using and employing people from the community was very beneficial. One funny story that I'll tell real quick is the first way they tried to get information out was using summer interns from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, which did not look like anybody that lived in the community. And so I was there one day when the students came back to the Green Impact Zone office, and they were like, nobody opened the door for us. And, and it was kind of like, well, there's a reason why, and people were calling the office like, who are all these little kids walking around our neighborhood? And so again, it's really like, recognizing the place you're in, recognizing, just the trauma or the challenges that people are experiencing and what they've been through, and again, like what role as a stakeholder or actor you played in that.
Thanks for that question. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's important to a lot of communities who have been disenfranchised and taken advantage of in a lot of cases. I think Indigenous knowledge, we've all heard the stories by pharmaceutical industry kind of utilizing some of the Indigenous knowledge in plants that from around the world and creating profits that doesn't come back or impact in a positive way the tribal communities. So in Maine even, we've had a tremendous amount of work to do to rebuild trust in tribal communities because of research that was thought to be helpful. But again, in a lot of cases, research was done, findings weren't shared back with the community, publication was done. So trust is incredibly important, and it takes time. It takes time. And I really like Tony's point about reaching out to the community. Who's the research for? The researcher maybe be for the community, right? And they devise the research questions. They have an investment in the outcomes. Their outcomes are shared. So I think trust is very important. And the other thing that Tony, I think, mentioned that I think is important is who is the face? Who is coming to the community? And I can tell you, at least, I've been working at the university for 20 years, and I was one of the first Native faculty members at the University of Maine. And since then, we've hired a few more. Darren Ranko, who's now the chair of the Native American program, he's also Penobscot. But having a Native face, having the relationship is a mechanism for creating, I think, trust. And one of his first steps, too, was also looking at the IRB, or how we do research, and looking at that closely so that you can help to build that trust when you have research. in those communities. It's extremely important. And the final thing I want to say, too, with trust, which I think is sometimes difficult, is just the very changing dynamic of our political system, at least with what we see. We have some administrations that are for, and some of it fluctuates, and sometimes that hurts trust. When you have that fluctuation and change in policy directions over time, it's very disruptive to trust.
Can I add one more thing? One more thought on trust. I'm not sure that distrust is a bad thing. I think I try to train my students to distrust everything that they hear, and so I'm starting to think that maybe distrust is a empowering set of tools that helps us to get to the root of a problem. But that's just one more little.
Thank you to the panelists. This is really great, and Summer, thank you so much for that comment just now, because I wanted to think about. I think climate change lends itself sort of by nature to structural solutions, and I think that those things are important. So I'll preface that by saying that. And I think one of the challenges in so many cases is that there's a kind of not a waiting for, but a kind of reliance on, well, what's going to happen, how is the state, or how's the government going to intervene? When will we get a program that we trust that's actually doing things that are to our benefit? And I'm wondering, and this is because I haven't heard very much about this, is because as you probably know from yesterday, I'm kind of interested in smaller scale things, just to see what people are doing kind of on their own to sort of take power into their own hands in various ways, right? And it's, again, not in the absence of the structural things that have to happen, because I don't believe in individual level solutions, but I'm curious to think from all of you, right? Are there cases in communities where you're people are just we can't wait on X, Y, and Z, right? We're gonna try to do something here, and how that might have worked out. Yeah.
So I will invite the three speakers to respond, but fairly quickly, if you could, because we're just at time, and we can continue the discussion after lunch. It's a great question.
I can start. I love that question, and thanks. I wish I had more time to talk about my other cases. I also look at Guyana in South America as a case where they've basically been abandoned, colonial, ruins there, and people are using whatever resources they have to deal with that situation in a way that I think of as very poetic and empowering, and really changing how I understand regeneration, and really interesting ways that sort of contradict the sort of building with nature narrative that's coming out of first world countries like the Netherlands. So I will say we should talk more about that later.
Yeah, great question. The Detroit case that I briefly discussed, which I'm just getting into it, but this is an example of people saying, we're going to get engaged in this process, and we're going to tell the utility who we pay monthly where we want our energy to come from. They've used some citizen science. They've partnered with NRDC, which is not an organization that necessarily partners with urban communities, and said, get your lawyers on board and support us and help us make this case. They've also went to the Sierra Club, and so I do think around this issue of climate change, especially as it intersects with energy, is a way that communities can get engaged themselves and push the decisions that they want to see. And so I'm excited to watch when the plan actually is decided, how much of the community's engagement, their recommendation is in the final plan.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just from my personal experience, I've been fairly successful over the past 10 or so years getting grant money for planning, but sometimes where the rubber hits the road is implementation of the plan. And there's no resources available, or they're very difficult to find in terms of taking steps of implementing the plan. And some of these planning steps, you're talking not a lot of money, but the devastating effects that could happen if you don't take those steps now, it's going to be lots of money. And so there's really kind of a disconnect, I think, in some cases of the resources that need to happen when you have plans developed. It's an empty exercise in a sense, you know.
So thank you to our panelists. Thanks to all of you for participating. I hope that the questions that we posed at the beginning, you have some additional thoughts about them. And I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists once more.